Well, it's good afternoon over here, but I assume it's good morning for you. What part of the world are you in, Alvin?
I'm in New York, and it
Okay.
is the morning. It's Friday morning when I generally go to the farmer's market to go shopping for my food. But today I'm talking to you instead.
And we're going to be talking about your podcast, which goes live on the 15th of September. And when I got the press release about this, I definitely wanted to talk to you because there was a few issues, a few topics that you cover which are pertinent to now.
Yes.
But talk to me about the journey in terms of bringing this to market, because I know it wasn't as simple as you jotting down the ideas in your head and then presenting them to somebody who was receptive, was it, Alvin? It was a little bit more
No,
difficult
not
than
at
that.
all. So in 2015, 2016, I did a BBC broadcast for Radio 4 called The Green Book. And it was a great program. You can still download it from the BBC's website and listen to it. But that program never aired in America. And I know that a lot of people in America don't know anything about the Green Book other than the movie. So I had this idea to do a road trip from Detroit to New Orleans and do a show that would basically air in America. It took me 3 years to get this idea off the ground. I would go to podcast commissioner, rejection, but I always believed that it was a good idea. And finally, at Macmillan, I met someone, Alyssa Martino, who got the idea and championed the product all along the way. So that's how the idea came to fruition. The reason we chose Detroit was because in 1910, the African American population of Detroit was 1.7% of the population. By 1970, it was 43.7% or thereabouts of the population. It had one of the largest increases during the Great Migration of Black people moving from the South to the North. So therefore, all of those people in the North, Detroit, would be coming back to visit relatives in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana. So we decided to recreate that trip.
You've interviewed, I believe, 40 people. I think 31 have made it into the
Yes.
series. So let's talk about, I guess, series one. Let's go from episode one. What can people expect? You've touched on Detroit, New Orleans. What can we learn from that first podcast? So.
Well, what's interesting about the first podcast is that we do not start in Detroit, although the trip started in Detroit.
Right.
All along the trip, Joel, when we were doing the actual road trip, what we discovered was that people were not only taking us into their memories of the places that had been in the Green Book, but then they would segue into a personal story, a deeply personal memory of that time, their encounter with authorities, their experiences on the road. So in the first episode, we decided to focus on the story of Hezekiah Jackson, who lives in Birmingham, Mississippi, and his family driving to Detroit and then going into a white suburb to get his Aunt Beatty's pay. I think she had died and they'd gone up for the funeral and they want to get her last paycheck. And so they pulled up to this house in this nice suburb owned by this white family. And immediately the white policeman descended and called his father a boy and was so demeaning. And he says, it was traumatizing for the family. Fast forward, my co-producer, Janée Woods Weber, asked him, have you ever had to talk to your own children about this conversation? He describes an incident where his nephew was stopped by the police pulling onto an expressway and the advice they had to give him. All these decades later, a similar situation, a similar confrontation. And so that's the thing that people will get from this first episode. These people we interviewed draw the connection from their experiences during the time the Green Book was published to today. And this happens a lot in that first episode. Some of the accounts are so deeply moving.
Mm. Well, talk about the disconnect between this Hollywood airbrushed depiction of that period in contrast to some of the things that you learned doing all the interviews.
That's a brilliant question, because most people didn't know about the Green Book until the movie. And I suspect that the movie was very casually named the Green Book because there are, I think, only 3 scenes in which the Green Book actually appears or has a significant place in the movie. First of all, a performer like Don Shirley would never have stayed in the type of place that he did in the Green Book. Throughout America during this time, there were great hotels, the A.G. Gaston in Birmingham, Alabama, the hotels in Cincinnati, the hotels in Louisiana that were high quality hotels where Lena Horne, Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, and Count Basie stayed. It would not have been that type of seedy hotel that you saw him stay in the movie. When I saw that scene, Joel, I said to me, there was nobody involved in this production who knew anything about the Green Book because they would have chosen differently. Also, a few other scenes that were very disturbing for me. When he goes to these white clubs in these towns, in almost every case, there would also be a simultaneous performance in a black club in the same town. So he wasn't just seeing white people all the time. Often later on that evening, there would be a performance at a black club. So the movie was off in many ways, but I tell everybody they need to remember one thing about the movie. The movie was written by the son of the driver. So everything in the movie is from the point of view of the driver, not the point of view of Doc Shirley, not the point of view of black people. So really, it's a movie, if you want to look at it more generally, it's about, and generously, it's a movie about the driver. It has very little to do with Don Shirley.
What did you learn that will stay with you from this series of interviews? Yeah, from doing the podcast, doing the interviews in connection to the pods.
I still have a very difficult time listening to some of the interviews because the people spoke so honestly that it just, no matter what your defenses were, how much you tried to put up defenses, it just went into your heart and through your heart. And I really struggled a lot. What I learned most was that people really had to have a lot of resilience, a lot of determination, and a lot of belief in themselves. There were white spaces and black spaces, and there was very little interaction between those. In the first episode, Hezekiah Jackson talks about his whole world growing up during segregation was about 5 miles. Everybody they knew was black, everybody they interacted with was black. They didn't know about the purpose of the Green Book until later in life. They thought when they traveled from Birmingham to New York to visit his uncle, Jerome, in New York, they thought the Green Book was just a way to patronize black businesses. They had no idea that it had to deal with fear and segregation in America. So you also learn about how the parents sought to protect their children for as long as they could. These images of black parents not caring about their children in ghettos and all of that sort of stuff, letting them run wild, was completely untrue. Parents were much more caring, and they really tried to instill in their children, the next generation, the values that they wanted to have achieved, the aspiration, and they wanted to keep them focused on that so that when they got to the moment where they encountered authority, and it invariably happened, they would not lose that focus on the future, about getting ahead, making your future better.
Despite some of the circumstances, one of the things I caught from just doing my own research was the overriding and recurring theme of forgiveness.
Yes.
Talk about that. Talk about that, because I guess you know those emotions could have been so different, but forgiveness keeps kind of raising its head.
I was raised in a deeply Southern Baptist world at the Mount Zion Missionary Baptist Church. And forgiveness is something that I have been taught all of my life. And I saw it in these people again and again and again. If you don't forgive,
Mm.
then you are trapped fighting that battle again and again and again. And as I've written about in several articles, you can't win fighting ghosts. Those people who did you wrong, they're not thinking about you today. You're fighting with something that they haven't even given a thought to. You need to forgive them. You need to forgive yourself and start looking forward to what you can do in the future. When I was growing up, Joel, I would often ask my parents about the past. Mama, what was it like when you were growing up in Thomasville, Georgia? Or Mama, why did you lose your eye? How did you lose your eye? This was my grandmother, we called her Mama. And my grandmother would look at me and she said, why are you asking me that question? I said, because I really want to know. She said, you know, this is my past, not yours. What I want you to focus on is the future. If I've been able to forgive those people for causing me to lose my eye, then you don't need to fight with them. I want you to focus on your future because that's the thing you can change in your life. And everybody in this series that we talked to had that characteristic of forgiveness. They didn't forget. They took the wisdom with them into the future to make better, smarter decisions, to pass that wisdom on to the next generation, but they did not get caught in the trap of fighting ghosts.
I guess my last question would center on the connecting themes surrounding racial tension then
Yes.
and now.
It's very difficult when you listen to some of the things that happened in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and then you watch what's happening on television in the current news cycle. How much is being captured and broadcast around the world. It makes you really wonder how much attitudes in America have changed. I think many things in America are better. Certainly the ability to get an education, the ability to buy property in certain areas or to get jobs in corporations. But yet the institutionalized racism, the institutionalized condescension toward African Americans still exists. It was more brutal, some would say, in the past. I do question that when you see what's on the news with the shooting of Black men. I really question that. But what to me is most disturbing is the fact that it's still tolerated. During the Black Lives Matters movement and the demonstrations that occurred, the thing that gave me hope was that the young people involved in the movement were of all colors and of all generations. In the 60s, when young people were out trying to get the vote, trying to change the culture, it was mostly Black people alone out there. But I'm encouraged by just the faces, the colors, the races, the ethnic group that are participating in the Black Lives Matters movement. That gives me hope. But when you see what's in the news today, and then you listen to what the people in my podcast talk about happened to them back then, you can sometimes just shake your head and wonder, how long, oh Lord, how long? In this program, I interviewed Senator Hank Sanders, who is the first African-American elected to the Mississippi Senate since Reconstruction. And he participated in the Selma to Montgomery March, led by Martin Luther King. And he said, during that walk, Martin Luther King would say, how long? And the crowd would yell back, not long. How long? Not long. So I asked Senator Sanders, who's in his 70s today, if Martin Luther King asked that question today, how long? How would you respond? And he said, Dr. King, I did not know or realize that you were talking biblical years, because he, Senator Sanders, underestimated the depth of white supremacy in America.
Driving the Green Book, new Apple podcast, co-produced by Alvin Hall, is available on September the 15th. There are going to be a lot of people, Alvin, who want to speak to you, have conversations with you, probably referencing different parts of the podcast as they consume it. Where can they find you? Are you on social? Do you do all of that?
I do social media. You can Google me. You'll find an address that goes straight to my agent, which comes to me. Also, Macmillan has a website or mail address up, which they can get from the website, drivingthegreenbook.com. If you go there, there'll be an area where you can email me directly there, and I will be looking at the questions that come through on a regular basis when I'm not going shopping on Fridays to the farmer's market to buy food.
which is where you would have been had we not been having this parlay. Listen, I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk about this. I love this series. I love this topic, and I love talking to people about it and making them aware of this part of history that most people outside of America in particular did not even know about. And many people, even people who live in my building, had no idea about this part of American history.